All right, folks, let's talk about PlayStation 5 Pro. We are very close to this thing probably getting announced very soon. If it's anything like PS4 Pro, which was announced in early September for a November launch, then we're pretty much right in the danger zone of Sony finally confirming this thing's existence, which they are surely going to do because we have so much evidence of it being a thing. I mean, it's not a secret. I mean, that's what we were hearing out of Gamescom recently, is that a lot of developers, it was just an open secret, just talking about the platform because everybody at this point has dev kits. There was one report on WCCF Tech where apparently one developer that they won't name openly talked about the spec sheet for PS5 Pro, and they were, quote, confident that Unreal Engine 5 would run much better on the new hardware compared to the regular PlayStation 5. And this kind of goes back to a separate report, on multiplayer.it, where somebody over there, again, talking about PS5 Pro and how I guess one studio wants to, or one indie developer or something like that, they want to delay their game so they can have it ship with PlayStation 5 Pro support. And because the upside for a developer in the here and now would be to get a PS5 Pro enhancement label. It's a complete expectation that when Sony does finally release PlayStation 5 Pro, there would be a particular setting on the storefront, or a filter, I should say, for PS5 Pro enhanced games, and that would be extremely vital even for smaller studios to be able to join that filter, because it's going to be a much smaller pool of games versus the 4,000 plus that are available on PlayStation Network right now, or the 4,000 individual titles, I should say. So it's really hard to be seen and have that sort of visibility on the storefront. So a lot of studios are probably going to try and get a PS5 Pro enhancement label. But the point I want to get at here is the console and 60 frames per second, because that has been a recurring thing we're seeing a lot now with some of the big AAA titles that have come out recently. Whether they're on PlayStation or not, it's simply in the high-end console space, where we recently had the art director at Obsidian say they're targeting 30 FPS for Avowed. Starfield came out at 30 FPS, but then eventually got a 60 FPS mode, which those two games might just be like, that might be a byproduct of trying to hit a release date. Maybe they just had a very strict deadline that Microsoft said, you have got to get this game out the door, and then they had time afterwards to finally work on that 60 FPS mode. So they might be doing some lip service in the here and now for just trying to say, oh, we're targeting 30 and we don't necessarily need to do 60. That was the big thing with Avowed at the time. But there are third-party games that are starting to hit that ceiling. So Monster Hunter Wilds is looking like that game is probably going to be 30. Dragon's Dogma 2 is still very unstable with its unlocked frame rate, even though there is a 30 FPS cap now that's available, and that's really the more ideal option for that game, actually. We have some high performance mode games that still, like, that's not necessarily a locked 60. So there's been a lot of talk now with 60 on console, and how we are starting to see more examples of games that are struggling to hold a very consistent 60. And this kind of gets into a long and tired conversation we keep having about cross-gen and console architectures. The console is very similar to PlayStation 4. That's why cross-gen is so much more financially advantageous nowadays versus consoles that were very bespoke in nature, and that's how they can oftentimes be very optimized. And so I don't want to repeat that conversation again. I think I would hope, understand why we've had a very long cross-gen period, especially with how long games take to make and COVID. So that's why. But it's like, now that we have that turnover, right, a lot of big publishers and bigger studios might now only be targeting the high-end console space, that being Series S, X, and PlayStation 5. You might see them start to really push the boundaries of these consoles, and frame rate historically in the console space is always the first thing to go. It really did take this long up until we got to a sort of scenario where now it's very commonplace to offer performance modes, and games that just typically never got 60 on, say, the PlayStation 2, now they get them all the time on PlayStation 5, right? That's the big difference. And I'll always beat this point home too. Older consoles could have always done 60, but it was simply a matter of how a studio wanted to make that game, what kind of scope and budget they were dealing with. And typically it was always something where they would sacrifice frame rate in order to just be able to improve the visual fidelity of the game, because that was also a time where visual fidelity really did matter. It was your bread and butter marketing material, is how how good and pretty the game looked, whether it was PS1, 2, 3, and even PlayStation 4. So again, hope we're all on the same page here. But now that so many people are used to having 60 on console, there's been this big complaint now with some recent titles and only having 30 as an option. So with PlayStation 5 Pro now coming into the space, I am curious about this because I did always mention this too with like PS4 Pro. That console still fit a role at the time, which was the mass adoption of 4K televisions. This has been well documented for why Sony wanted to do PlayStation 4 Pro at the time, which was very unusual in the console space, which was having an actual on-paper performance upgrade for the console, but it was the same console and you were getting new performance settings on that platform versus the base machine. But that console was fitting in a product category of trying to retain hardcore PlayStation users, keep them off of PC, which that was very much a thing at the time, and also offering 4K image qualities with checkerboard rendering for PlayStation 4 games. That made sense at the time. There has been a lot of questioning right now with like, oh, do we really need a PlayStation 5 Pro? Another argument that I've said before is like I think we could have gone this entire cycle without PlayStation 5 Pro. Considering we have so many diminishing returns nowadays, it is something where with PSSR, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, ray tracing, these are all very, in the grand scheme of things, they can look very pretty and nice. But we could have very likely gone another 4-something years without those things up until, say, PlayStation 6. But I digress. What I am curious about, though, is that are we now in a landscape where, even though PS5 Pro is going to be considered more of a low-volume, expensive box for more enthusiast players, and full stop, that is very much what this thing is going to be, but will it have maybe a higher, sell-in ratio versus PS4 Pro? Because that was still low volume as well. That was still meant for more enthusiast customers. The metric we had at the time was 1 in every 5 PlayStation 4s was a Pro model. So it was not this mass number of Pros that were being sold, but it was still high enough to where that was a good business for Sony to be in, retaining those valuable customers that are high spend on a high average spend per box, I should say, right? Your most engaged customers that are going to buy multiple games per year, subscribe to Plus and this, that, and the other. So I'm curious if we'll see more of that on the Pro, since there is more awareness with frame rates. Because this was also something that was not nearly as big 15, 20 years ago, was how mindful console players were of their frame rates, right? Like a vast majority of people realistically did not care about frame rates. But now it's not really like that. It's actually kind of crazy how different it is nowadays, where so many people do understand it, know it, prefer it, and they want it on console. And that's good. I'm all for it, obviously. But I'm curious if it's if that would actually be the real tipping point for this console, to where maybe it's now going to be like maybe 2 out of every 5 PS5s that are sold is going to be a Pro model. But that's very contingent on if a lot of PS5 Pro enhancements are going to hinge on offering 60 FPS or a very stable 60 FPS target versus, say, the base platform. There is still a way that Sony is going to mandate this in terms of what developers can and cannot do. There still has to be, and there is, a parity clause, which is there's no exclusive software on PS5 Pro. They can't do things that are exclusive modes or something, but they can increase the performance of the base PS5 setting, and that's what you could expect on the Pro. That would include things like adding ray tracing, increasing frame rate, increasing base resolution or max resolution targets. So we're going to see a lot of examples kind of run the gamut here for the, really third party, I would say. First party you would expect is going to be the Premier Suite, right? When we have all these games debut, Sony's probably going to show this thing off with Spider-Man 2 and God of War Ragnarok and Forbidden West, and they'll all get patches on PSN for those that pick up a Pro. Those are probably going to be your bread and butter examples of how to go about doing it, and they'll utilize PSSR, and they'll probably be the greatest examples of what the console can realistically do. Because that's another argument I would make in the here and now. PS5 Pro won't just be this blanket answer for all these, like, say, unstable third-party games. We have a bunch of first-party games right now that run very well at 60 FPS on their performance settings, or they offer a 120 mode where it's in a 120 hertz container, but you can play at, say, 40 FPS and still get a very high visual fidelity and very sharp 4K looking image quality, and that's like a great compromise. it's a lot of this still falls down on the studio itself and how well they're optimizing these games, and if they even offer proper 120 modes on PlayStation 5 or in theory the Pro. We do know the Pro is probably still going to have a sort of retroactive boost setting, so you can toggle that on, and then that should in theory boost the performance of the existing software that we do have. So we could very well have a bunch of base PS5 software that, if it's unstable now, it'll run a lot better on the Pro. That's at least what we assume will happen. But I would maybe just caution that it's not necessarily a guarantee that this thing is going to be the be-all, end-all 60 FPS machine, especially since CPU-bound games are not really going to, like PS5 Pro is not really going to help a CPU-bound game, since the enhancement there is fairly minimal, because it's like a 10% bump over the standard PlayStation 5. So, but it's just some food for thought, because we are right near the console's announcement. So I feel like this machine might have more application and more desire than people are giving it credit for. PS4 Pro made a lot of sense at the time. This one I'm seeing a lot of folks question, why do we need a PS5 Pro? Of course you don't ever need it. But depending on the price, which it's still likely going to be in the $600 range, the consoles can't really price down anymore aggressively like they used to, but assuming the price is not totally out of position, I think you'll find a lot of those in the enthusiast space that want to keep their higher frame rates and they prefer playing on console might get a lot of mileage out of the Pro. And that's coming from somebody that really thought we were not going to get a Pro during this console cycle and just wait till PlayStation 6. But anyway, that's enough rambling. Thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.